Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
It is my deep joy and honor to welcome everyone to this year's Stone Lecture Series, one of Princeton Theological Seminary's most enduring and respected lectures. Established in 1871 by Trustee Levi P. Stone, this lectureship has for over 150 years brought the very best of theological minds to our campus to deliver a series of 5 lectures on the topic of their own choosing. The Stone Lectures are a gift to this community, an opportunity to reflect, an opportunity for us to wrestle, and an opportunity to be renewed by the kind of sustained theological inquiry that forms the very heart of this institution. This evening feels particularly significant as we have the opportunity to welcome back home a beloved scholar, teacher, and friend. Our own, and we will always say our own here at Princeton Theological Seminary, Dr. Choon-Leong Seow. Though Dr. Seow now holds the Buffington Cupples Chair in Divinity at Vanderbilt University, he remains very much in the air that we breathe here at Princeton Seminary. For more than 3 decades, Dr. Seow served on the faculty of the Bible department here. And most recently, he was the Henry Snyder Gehman Professor of Old Testament Language and Literature. His presence on this campus shaped generations of students and scholars with a rare combination of intellectual rigor, poetic sensibility, and pastoral generosity. And of course, for anyone who has taken Hebrew here on this campus, you have crossed through the burning sands of his grammar. Trained as an undergraduate at Pepperdine, and then coming here to Princeton Theological Seminary as a master's student where he worked with Professor Kathy Sackenfeld, who I see here among us today. And then moving on to train and earn his PhD at Harvard University, where he studied under the great Frank Moorcross. Dr. Seow is internationally renowned for his expertise in Hebrew Bible and Northwest Semitic philology. His scholarship has earned prestigious fellowships and prizes from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the W.F. Albright Institute in Jerusalem, and the Institute for Advanced Study right here in Princeton. His magisterial commentary on the book of Job exemplifies what makes Dr. Seow's work so remarkable. His meticulous attention to ancient texts, his theological depth, and his interdisciplinary imagination that draws upon Jewish, Christian, and Muslim interpretations, along with engagements with literature, music, and the visual arts. And this work will inform what promises to be an intellectually exciting and spiritually edifying week, this week here with the Stone Lectures. Tonight marks the beginning of his 5-part lecture series, Consequences of the Whirlwind Discourses in Job, with this evening's lecture entitled God's Eye Cosmology. My friends, please join me in giving a warm welcome home to Dr. Choon-Leong Seow.
Thank you, Mr. President. Colleagues, thank you very much for this great honor. Princeton Seminary will always hold a special place in my heart. It was here that I was first introduced to theology, theological education. It was here that I first fell in love with biblical studies as an academic discipline. I served over 30 years here with colleagues who become beloved friends, esteemed colleagues who become friends. So to me, this feels like coming home. And I thank you for your warm welcome. The book of Job has received universal acclaim as a literary classic. These are not reviews of my book, though I wish they were. Lending credence to its reputation as a classic are its longevity, its universal appeal, timelessness, profundity, and aesthetic excellence. But arguably, the clearest evidence of its place as a classic is its capacity to generate endless conversations. It has been a subject of commentary and rigorous debate by Jewish, Christian, and Muslim interpreters, and it's inspired countless literary iterations, polemical writings, well over 3,000 pieces of visual art, music, ranging from Roman chants to hard metal rock and punk rock and hip hop, and film and dance. Readers have struggled with, contested, and reimagined aspects of the story in myriad ways across diverse cultural contexts, all of which attesting to the unending relevance of Job. Indeed, even critiques, challenges, conflicts, as South African literary theorist John Coetzee avers, contribute to the survival of a classic. In this regard, one may compare a classic, the Job classic, or any classic, with Chinese landscape paintings like these. An artist who has completed such a painting would typically leave a stamp with a name, an epigram, yet this is only a moment in the work's history. For others who come along and add their perspectives, more epigrams, perhaps a poem that hints at another way of viewing the work. And these and other interpreters would add their stamps. Over time, a renowned painting might accumulate multiple annotations, even conflicting points of view, all of which contribute to the history of conversation. This history is most readily evident in the sequels of the work, but also its prequels, namely the antecedents to which the painting may allude. Now, no viewer can insist on engaging only the original painting's original meaning, as if we can somehow unsee all the rest of the painting. The painting incorporates its history of interpretation. It incorporates its history and invites the viewer to participate in the conversation the painting generates. This analogy illustrates what Hans Gadamer contends in his book, Truth and Method. Understanding is less a subjective act than it is participating in an event of tradition, a process of transmission in which past and present are constantly mediated. Hence, the task of an interpreter cannot be reduced to the explication of a recoverable original meaning, since no text ever comes to us unaffected by its Wirkungsgeschichte, history of effects. Other scholars prefer the umbrella term history or reception, though reception is arguably too passive a term, for the impact of a text can often be nefarious, even deadly. People die when you read text a certain way. That's not reception. Moreover, reception is hardly an accurate category for the indirect iterations of second, third, or later orders down a text genealogy. Iterations that are not conscious engagement of the text, the outcomes of an often circuitous history. I speak therefore of a history of consequences, meaning not only what comes after the text, but also, its consequences, not least its ethical impact. But this history does not begin after the text, nor even with the text, for every text is itself a consequence of antecedents. As Ezekiel 14 and 20 makes clear, there was a tradition of Job long before there was a book of Job. Indeed, there was a tradition of a pious sufferer in Mesopotamia that goes back all the way to a so-called Sumerian Job, the earliest manuscript of which comes from around 1750 BCE. Yet the title of this work is found in the library catalog from around 2100 BCE, which suggests that it was already a classic by that time. And yet, even in this earliest version of the story, we find already quotes of antecedent traditions. The same is true with the Epic of Gilgamesh, the most famous Mesopotamian classic. Even the earliest versions of Gilgamesh are not the beginning. There is, in fact, no recoverable beginning. So we read the text not as a static artifact with an old text, but we can only participate in an ongoing conversation in media res. Accordingly, the task of exegesis is not to excavate the text, to uncover what it once meant, nor is it only to consider what it means, as important as that surely is. Rather, it is to explore what the text has meant and can mean. Exegesis is about participating in the many conversations that a classic has generated. Theologian David Tracy has made a similar point in his work on the analogical imagination. Theology, says Tracy, is about participating in a conversation that a religious classic has generated. What I propose to do in this series of lectures is to invite you to join me in a conversation with a discrete portion of the Job classic, the Whirlwind Discourses. Without further ado then, let us begin with the first Whirlwind Discourse. It comes as the long-awaited response of Job's clamor, beginning in chapters 9 and 10, with his imagination of a courtroom encounter with the deity. This legal metaphor will persist in his speeches, which culminate in the final oath of innocence, ending with demand for a response from God, whom he calls his opponent. Let him answer me, says Job in 31:35. Yahweh's response, however, does not come immediately. Rather, situated between Job's demand for an answer and Yahweh's answer to Job are speeches by Elihu, son of Barak El, in chapters 32 to 37. The theology of revelation in Elihu's speeches reflect a tradition of Yahweh as El, whose mode of communication is through intermediaries, dreams, and visions. As befits an intermediary, however, Elihu also prepares the reader for what comes ahead. For he depicts God as a storm deity whose mode of revelation is direct, unmediated, and by way of storm. Hence, we read in 38:1. Then Yahweh answered Job from the storm wind. As Thomas Aquinas reads this superscription, the emphasis on God's direct response to Job implies the inadequacy of Elihu's mediated revelation as the best a human being can offer. Human wisdom falls short, and so a direct revelation from deity is necessary. To John Calvin, who unusually cast Elihu as the mouthpiece of the Holy Spirit, the speeches of Elihu should have sufficed as an answer to Job. Yet, when they were not, God proceeds to edify the presumptuous questioner of divine justice by a terrifying yet gracious presence. Yahweh's response to Job is a testimony to the abundance of divine mercy, says Calvin. Early rabbinic interpreters, noticing that the text speaks not of the storm wind, not of a storm wind, but rather of the storm wind, point out that there is in fact an earlier mention of a storm wind in 9:17, where Job complains that God has bruised him, bis'ara, by a storm wind, which recalls the great wind that destroyed his family in 119. As the rabbis had it, the God who hurt Job through a storm wind now heals him through a storm wind. Early Christian interpreters too interpreted the theophany as an act of divine grace, as God reaches out to a human being amid suffering. Thus, Gregory of Nazianzus. Methodius of Olympus understood the storm to be a metaphor for calamities befalling Job, though Job has survived them, and so God now rewards him with an answer by way of a revelatory storm. For John Chrysostom, the theophany represents the will of a wholly transcendent God to be immanent. Gregory the Great makes a point similar to what Jewish interpreters have made, that God speaks out of a storm to one who has been scourged by a storm wind. The parallel introductions to the two divine speeches identify the topic for each speech. The topic of the first speech is Etzah. The topic of the second is Mishpat. The first term, Etzah, has a range of meanings, and these are reflected in the translations. Traditionally, counsel, but more recently, some suggested plan, so NASB, intention, so the New Jerusalem Bible, or design, New English Bible, all possible meanings of the term. In any case, commentators understand the topic of the first speech in various ways. It is about Yahweh's Etzah in the sense of Yahweh's counsel to Job regarding a proper response to suffering. Or it is about divine Etzah as in the sense of providence in nature as in history. Or the deity's Etzah, plan of action in history. Or deity's Etzah in the sense of the will in creation and in cosmic governance. A grand design, says David Klein, for how the universe should be structured and managed. But how has Job darkened the divine Etzah? In the first place, Yahweh addresses Job as Gever, a man, in 3a. That harks back to Job's self-reference as Gever in his initial poem in 3.3, the beginning of a counter-cosmic rant uttered ostensibly as a curse of his birthday. But as Didymus the Blind pointed out long ago, Job was speaking not as a man, but as man. That is, a representative of humanity. In calling out, in challenging God, and calling for the undoing of creation. Notably, Job says, "Let there be darkness," which reverses God's will, "Let there be light." So to medieval Jewish interpreters. Importantly, Job has used this very term Etzah in chapter 12, where he speaks of God's Etzah. God's Etzah along with wisdom and might and understanding as he impugns God's oversight of the cosmos. God alone has the wherewithal to govern the cosmos, and yet the world seems utterly messy. There seems to be no Etzah, no plan. And there's no question that the hand of Yahweh, the power of God, is responsible for this messy world. So Job argues. Job suggests this truth is obvious even to the creatures of creatures of the universe, creatures of heaven and the earth and the sea. It is surely no coincidence then that Yahweh's first movement in the divine discourse on Etzah has 4 stanzas on the earth, the sea, heaven, and the netherworld, the last of which Job could not have known anything about because he hasn't been there. Yahweh is responding to Job's questioning of the divine Etzah, God's Etzah in the governance of the cosmos, the discrepant nature of which Job has parodied. So Yahweh's discourse picks up on Job's rhetoric of cosmological inquiry. Only now it is Yahweh who asks, while Job, who has so glibly presupposed the outcome of such an inquiry, is challenged to teach Yahweh. So the entire speech is didactic in tone, as evident in the recurrence of the terms know, understand, understanding, wisdom, and in the preponderance of questions. This didacticism is manifest too in a series of examples pertaining to these 3 areas of human inquiry in antiquity. Cosmology, in the initial movement, meteorology, in the central pivotal movement, and zoology, in a culminating movement. We have time today to only consider the initial movement, the introduction of the speech, as it were. The initial stanza of this movement presents a creation of Earth as a building project. Commentators often lament the dearth of parallels to the idea of creation as a building project by God, except perhaps in Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation story, where Marduk, the god of Babylon, constructs his own abode. All those commentators say, that's it. That's all we know about God as builder. But we should note first 2 overlooked passages within the Bible. The first is in Psalm 78, verse 69, concerning the temple in Jerusalem as the divine abode. And this abode, this temple, is at once like heaven and like the earth. Heaven is like heaven and like the earth. The second passage is in Numbers 9, verse 6. Though the conceptual background of this passage is lost in most English translations. For the term ma'alot, steps or stairs, has been translated as chambers, so the Tanakh, the Jewish Public Society translation, the upper chambers, so NRSV, lofty place, and the like, none of which is found in Biblical Hebrew. Likewise, the term agudah, barn, is rendered as vault, NRSV, foundation, so NIV, again meanings you do not find anywhere in Hebrew. Underlying both passages is a Mesopotamian view or a step temple, the zikkurat, as a cosmic mountain. The zikkurat is imagined as a cosmic tree with its roots deep in the netherworld and its top reaching the heavens. It sounds like Genesis, Tower Babel story. That's the background. That's polemic. The temple, the skyscraper of the alluvial plain of ancient Sumer, forms a vertical axis of the cosmos. And it is often called, in Mesopotamia, the bond of heaven and earth. That is a temple, is a link joining heaven to the earth. That's the background in Amos 9. Nothing to do with vaults or foundations. The temple was a microcosm of the universe. Accordingly, temple construction was an earthly performance of the creation of the cosmos. In that regard, then, we have plenty of parallels in the ancient world. The most famous temple builder was Gudea, of ancient city of Lagash in Sumer, around 21-25 BCE. Gudea's architectural achievements are recounted in over 100 inscriptions. Especially pertinent for purposes here are two versions of the construction of the temple, his construction of the temple in nearby Gyeosu. We have a prose historical account found on certain statues and a mythopoeic version preserved on two large clay cylinders. According to the prose account, Gudea, in recognition of his own brilliance, initiated a plan. He drew a plan and he personally oversaw the project. It was his project from beginning to the end. In fact, there are two statues of Gudea with his laptop. Laptop that shows his plan with a stylus and a ruler. In the mythopoeic version, the decree was for the project was issued from on high. Gudea was predestined as a Presbyterian by the gods to build a temple. The decree was from on high. Gudea was chosen because of his exceptional intelligence, and the plan was revealed to him in a dream. The temple is said to have its roots deep in Ki, Sumerian for earth and underworld, with its top reaching An Ki, Sumerian term for cosmos. The temple was thus a cosmic mountain, a bond linking An and Ki, heaven and earth. The construction itself was an earthly reenactment of creation. As soon as the foundation was laid, abundance came in the form of water to benefit all humanity. And the temple was a spectacle, a symbol of verdant mountain that was the world. The building metaphor is apt in the opening stanza of Yahweh's discourse on the divine Eitzah. Eitzah corresponds to plan in Gudea's inscriptions. The poet depicts the execution of this plan by laying out a systematic process of construction with the appropriate idioms of architecture, civil engineering, and the first steps of the construction. These idioms are common in temple construction texts, including Gudea. Determine its measure, stretch out a line over it, its bases sunk, laid its cornerstone. and the commencement of the project suffices to bring celestial celebration as the morning stars together cheered, and all divine beings gave a festive shout in anticipation of the completion of the project. The second stanza concerns the creation of the sea, which was by circumscription, by confining of the waters. The first line in verse 8 recalls Job's initial counter-cosmic rant in chapter 3. On the one hand, it recalls his complaint that God did not close the double doors of the womb in which he gestated, thus causing him to emerge from the womb to exist in a world beset by misery. On the other hand, this same verse, the initial verb vayaseh, echoes 3:23, where Job complains that God has shut him in, confined him. And what he means by this confinement is fleshed out in verse 23 by his comparison of his outpourings, his outcry with cosmic waters. The language of roaring poured out like the waters is reminiscent of mythological references to the unruly waters of the cosmos. Job is suggesting that God may well shut him in, just as the divine warrior might confine force of chaos, but Job's outpourings will be loud anyway. Job seems to align himself with the rebellious, unruly waters of the cosmos. Yahweh's response, therefore, asserts divine purpose as regards the control of unruly waters. The response returns to the topic of this confinement, though the idiom now pertains to the birthing of the sea. As if playing on Job's complaints, Yahweh speaks of the confinement of the sea, but also, ironically, of sea's emergence from the womb. Shut in, but departs. The language in verse 8 recalls the tradition of the Creator placing limits on the sea. So in Proverbs 8:29, Psalm 104, verse 9. The sea, which in mythology represents cosmic chaos that must be subdued, is here imagined as an infant whose birth is according to divine purpose. The point here is the management of chaos. Shut in, but birthed. This is the third occurrence of the idiom to depart from the womb. It first occurs with Job's complaint of his emergence from the womb to a world of suffering. Yahweh's rhetoric on the birth of the sea is therefore a retort to Job's protests in this regard. God's answer is, it's all part of divine plan. The deity who controls the chaotic potential of the sea also brings it forth amid turbulence. And Yahweh cares for the restless sea as one cares for an infant. Job has complained about receiving parental care, which enabled his survival, though he wished he had died in infancy or even not be birthed at all. So now the poet points to divine care of the infant sea. God provides for this enfant terrible with the clouds as his clothing, the nimbus as his swaddling cloths, symbols at once of care and restraint. The containment of the unruly sea is reinforced by the barring of these doors, which echoes Mesopotamian mythology regarding the barring of the sea, as in the recurrent mention of the bars of the sea in Atrahasis, the Babylonian flood story. Culminating the account of the containment of the sea is Yahweh's assurance. And I said, thus far you shall come and no farther. And here the search of waves is stayed. All through history, interpreters have seen this as a way to contain the ambitious people in the church, or a way to contain the Muslims coming to Europe, or a way to contain the Ottomans, or as Rush Limbaugh would have it, the way to contain the immigrants coming from the south. All this part of the consequences of this text. The verb for the staying of the sea is reminiscent of Levantine mythology regarding the subjugation of the sea monsters. So with this mention of the stopping of the sea, the stanza closes. The third stanza concerns the heavens. Just as Yahweh determines the place of the sea, so Yahweh determines the stations of the celestial hosts, the stars and the gods. An issue here is the placement of these celestial hosts as part of creation, with the stars in their assigned spots in the sky, just as God have their assigned spots in the pantheon. The fact that this stanza follows the one preceding, following the one containing of the sea, fits the pattern in mythology. In the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation account, the defeat of the sea monster Tiamat leads to the triumphant Marduk, stretching one half of the carcass of Tiamat like the firmament. And then Tiamat proceeds to set the stations of the stars in the heaven. So the waters are contained and kept in place, so too are the hosts of heaven. As part of this ordering is the divine response to those members of the celestial hosts that do not seem to know their stations. Underlying this stanza is the mythic imagination of rebellion in the divine assembly by astral deities. They see the falling stars. They imagine that to be about deities who have rebelled against God falling. Among such accounts are those that highlight the astral deities who did not know their stations. Scholars recognize such a myth as underlying Isaiah 14, which speaks of the fall from heaven of Halil ben Shahar, luminary, son of dawn, who sought to rise above the stars of Ale and set his throne in the seat of the assigned assembly, and even aspires to be like Elyon, the Most High. But Yahweh's plan for the cosmos cannot be undermined by such misconduct. Yahweh is able to take hold of the entire world, the extremities of the world, and rid it of its reprobates. Those who aspire to rise above the stations will have their ambitions upended, for they will be turned over like clay, the state of mortals that contrasts with that of celestial beings. Indeed, they who once come to stand before God will be overturned and they become like mortals, a trope we find also in Psalm 82, where the gods who rebel who act wickedly are then cast from the heavens, and their downfall will be for shame. The humiliation of the reprobates who do not know their stations echoes the eschatological vision in Isaiah 24, which predicts Yahweh's punishment of celestial hosts, along with their earthly counterparts, which will result in the fall of the celestial luminaries, Isaiah 24, 21 to 23. As Yahweh's speech continues, one learns of the withholding of light, the defining quality of stars. It is not up to Job to call for the absence of light, as he tried to do in 3 verse 9. Rather, Yahweh is the one who determines when to withhold light from these reprobate luminaries. The idiom to break the arm is tested frequently for divine action against various hostile forces. The poet hints at the nature of the offense of the astral reprobates, an offense that will bring divine retribution. If the raised arm is an allusion to some visible constellation in the heavens, as some scholars suggest, that sight in the sky might have evoked connections with the myth of astral revolt. Yes, Yahweh will end the revolt, and thus the stanza ends. The final stanza concerns the netherworld, the deepest realm of the cosmos. This is the locus of the sources of the sea and the recesses of the deep. Designation that recalls mythology for the abode of the gods at a mountain in northern Syria. There, the cosmic realms of earth, sea, heaven, and the netherworld converge. According to Mesopotamian cosmic geography, the netherworld lies beneath the sources of the subterranean waters that fed the Tigris and Euphrates. Various texts therefore represent the journey to the interior of the netherworld as a journey undertaken on foot, but sometimes on boat. Scholars who do not pay attention to this background, one scholar suggested that this text cannot be authentic because Job, after all, is not a scuba diver. But we have to know the traditions that Job engages. In any case, the deceased traveler on this journey faces a series of gates, variously called the gates of the land of no return, the gate of the underworld, the gate of the expansive netherworld, and so forth. So too, verse 17 speaks of the gates of death and the gates of death's shadows that Job could not have seen. Myth is in view as well in verse 18. For the Hebrew, for the expanses of the netherworld, recalls Akkadian designations of the underworld as the expansive netherworld. Job, who is yet alive, surely could not have entered this realm, nor could he have walked about there. He could not have had access to it or seen it. He could not comprehend it. Job himself has referred to the netherworld as a place where those go cannot return. So how would he know what's in the netherworld? Then, just as Yahweh challenges Job in the first line of this movement in verse 4 to declare what he knows regarding the founding of the Eretz in the sense of the earth, so verse 18b, Yahweh challenges Job to declare what he knows of the Eretz, now in the sense of the netherworld. That is the first and last line of this movement, together form an inclusio, a bracket, framing the stanzas of the earth and the sea, and heaven and the netherworld. Earth and the sea are the length and breadth of the cosmos, the horizontal axis of the cosmos. The heaven and netherworld are the height and depth of the cosmos, its vertical axis. Moreover, the end of each stanza is marked by clear closural clues, the proleptic reference to the celebration of successful construction of the project, so verse 7, the stoppage of the sea, so verse 11, the breaking of the upraised arm of celestial rebels, verse 15, and a summative term, all of it. This deliberate structure in the initial poetic movement manifests wisdom and design, thus making the point of Yahweh. There is design. So it's not a design claim. Design is the point. Well, I would like, in conclusion, to begin first by considering an artistic interpretation of Job. In this piece by Marc Chagall, Chagall had been long interested in Job and done several pieces on Job. This was his last and the most ambitious rendering of Job. It's a tapestry commissioned by the Medical Research Hospital, formerly known as the Rehabilitation Lab of Chicago, now known as the Shirley Ryan Ability Lab. And this tapestry still hangs there. It's based on Job 14, verse 7. Now, what intrigues me about this, and there's a lot to talk about in this piece, but we have no time, so I want to come back to one point. The issue of conversation. A unique feature of this rendering of Job are the number of people there holding books. You notice there's here Job holding a book. There are 4 persons here, holding a book, so holder or reader of a book here, and a reader of a book at the top. So there's 7 readers. So, in contrast to Christian interpreters who read the book of Job as a veritable textbook for systematic theology, Jewish interpreters have always regarded Job as a polyphonic text, a text that encapsulates multiple voices, offering viable perspectives. Beginning with the philosophical interpreters, starting in the 9th century by Sa'di of Gaon, Jews saw the interlocutors all offering voices, all offering opinion about the place of about providence and suffering to Job. Their views were regarded parallel to Job. Christians regarded only Job's view as correct because Job represents Christ, and so the friends represent the opposite heretics. So for Christians, there's only one view. See? But for Jews, all the views are viable. So representing this view, Chagall depicts several interpreters of the book. Of course, there is at the bottom you see three bearded men holding books. 1, 2, 3, and a visibly younger figure whom I take to be Elihu. Then there's a top, clearly an angel, an angelic interpreter with a Torah scroll behind him. This is surely the angel of the Lord, a circumlocution in Jewish theology for God. So this is God's voice, so this represents the divine speeches. Then at the center, there's a reader sitting down, the smallest reader of all, before the biggest reader, namely Job. Who is this 7th reader? There are no 7 readers in the book of Job. Let me suggest that the reader is you. The reader is one who sits Shiva before Job on an ash heap. This is among the interpreters of the book of Job. You, the reader, are invited to participate. In the conversation that's been taking on. The same point I made about landscape paintings, Chinese landscape paintings. Decades before Chagall, in 1941, Martin Buber wrote an essay on Job entitled in Hebrew, She'elat Doro Shel Iyov, the question of the generation of Job. It was later translated, in part, into English and published in The Prophetic Faith, 1948. Buber sets the story of Job in the context of Babylonian exile. Notice that Job is in quotes because Job represents Israel. And so the question of the generation, the question of his generation, is the question the sufferers ask. Why? Like other Jewish interpreters before him, Buber reads Job as a polyphonic text with different portrayals of God. He posits 4 portraits of God. You have first the God of the prologue, who's a cruel God who gratuitously harms Job. Then you have the second Job, the Job of the friends. This is a retributive God, the God of Torah. And then you have Job's God, who's a God who hides the divine face, the hiding God. And the 4th portrait is God of the divine speeches. To Buber, the God who speaks through the whirlwind is the Deus Revelatus, as opposed to Job's Deus Asconditus. Moreover, the divine revelation, says Buber, is a personal self-disclosure. God's personal self-disclosure to the individual. A holy, transcendent God who wills to be immanent, who personally reveals to a suffering human who asks why. And it is in this personal outreach to the suffering person that the deity becomes thou, corresponding to the sufferer's I. The revelation, says Buber, is not simply about mysteries of God as creator. Who doesn't know that? Creation is here presented as founding, seeing, commanding, and appointing. God speaks of boundaries and outer limits, and within that is the place of the human being. For Buber, the natural order of the cosmos is justice. Those human beings can only know a justice in their context. The purpose of the cosmology to Buber is to teach Job about the place of humanity in the cosmos. Joining this conversation is another interpreter, a more recent one, Terrence Malick. In his film, The Tree of Life, Malick offers a contemplative exegesis of Job through this cosmological passage, The Tree of Life, a film that won him the Palme d'Or Award in 2011 at Cannes Film Festival, along with many other accolades. The film revolves around the impact of death upon the O'Brien family of Waco, Texas, sometime in the 1960s. The film opens with a quote from Yahweh's speech. "Where were you when I laid foundation of the earth, when the morning stars sang together and all the heavenly beings shouted for joy?" This quote, shown for several seconds on black and white screen before giving way to a flame-like light, a light that comes up, and light, in fact, I was going to say light appears as a light motif. It appears as a visual motif throughout the film. Light is seen throughout the film, illuminating the cosmos, shining through the clouds and darkness, shining through an oak tree in front of the O'Brien family house. This light, some interpreters take to mean divine presence. I take to mean life itself, shining amid darkness and light that is life. The film soon takes the viewer on a wondrous exploration of the cosmos. And you see the wonders of the cosmos, the wordless sequence for 20 minutes. No words except for music. Zbigniew Preissner's Lacrimosa, a requiem about the tears, the days of tears being played as the beauty of the cosmos is being shown. Viewers then see the formation of galaxies and planets and the stars, and they see the incipience of microbes and the prehistoric evolution of life. And amid this ethereal splendor of creation, there are also eruptions of violence and destruction, as in the crashing of a asteroid on Earth that turns living creatures all dead and turns the world to dust. Nonetheless, new life emerges after the violence, and new species thrive. The creatures of the earth, too, sometimes manifest gratuitous cruelty. We have a scene of a dinosaur who comes upon a wounded dinosaur and needlessly proceeds to step on the head of the wounded dinosaur. And yet, all of a sudden, the dinosaur stops and moves away. Such contradictions are among the puzzling realities of the cosmos. So Malick reflects in his film script how strange that calamity and disease should lead life forward, proof indispensable to its unfolding. So here we have, even in the cosmos, evidence of pointless cruelty and yet the beginning of conscience. Interspersed with all these cosmic scenes of sublime images of the cosmos are vignettes of the mundane vicissitudes of life experienced by the O'Brien family. The story unfolds mostly through flashbacks viewed from the perspective of the couple's oldest son, Jack O'Brien, J-O-B. So viewers who saw this, so throughout then you get all these voiceovers. Who are you? What are you? How can you be found? Where will you be found? And so forth. Or questions asked in the speeches of Yahweh. Viewers, so this film when it was filmed, half the audience booed, the others cheered. So some reviewers seeing this are very harsh in their critique. They perceive Malik to present, to downplay suffering. At least the mundane don't matter, as this suffering really doesn't matter in view of the cosmos beauty. Others think that the point is that the beauty of the earth is more telling about nature of God than it is about mundane life. But I'm not sure that's the case. The point, perhaps, in this juxtaposition of the cosmos and life is that when juxtaposed with the grand history of billions of years, the grand cosmos, questions about justice are but a blip. They do not adequately account for the nature of God. The Yahweh speech makes a similar point. The poet relativizes human knowledge regarding the purpose of Creator, and ends with the conclusion that we don't know all of it. Yahweh challenges Job in spatial and temporal terms. Job was not present when the earth was made, nor has he descended to the netherworld to have personal insights into it. So God's speech pressed the boundaries, you see. That's contrasting with Job's view. This contrasts with Job's hermeneutic. When Job questioned God's itzah, it is from the perspective of his personal responses, what his ear tests and what his mouth tastes. And then from there, he moves on to the community, wisdom, and from there to observation of the world, and from there to lessons learned from nature. But in Yahweh's God-I cosmology, Job's I theology is relativized. Humans cannot know all of it. Thank you very much.
Has agreed to take a few questions, so let you field your own. If you could just, before asking your question, if you could just introduce yourself, we would appreciate that. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Zach, first year MTS student here at PTS. You mentioned that, and thank you very much for this very interpretation of Job. You mentioned that we should view the book of Job polyphonic, or with a multiple view. And you also mentioned that the earlier versions of Job, such as Sumerian Jobs, and in this multiphonic, this multiple views evolved over time, or was this initially the characteristics of this book? Was this evolved over these multiple conversations over time? And I don't know how that played out.
So difficult to know because some of the earliest text, Sumerian text, is only one voice. But very soon after that, you get a dialogical form. Scott has written on this very topic. The dialogue is among the earliest, one of the earliest versions already has a dialogue. The Babylonian theodicy also involves cycles of dialogue. Cycles between the orthodox, between the sufferer, who challenges orthodoxy, and orthodox friend. So this dialogue going on throughout, but none presents as many voices as the book of Job. Yes, Donna.
Donna Eli, I'm an alum from 1989. And Dr. Seow, you may get to this later in the week. I wonder what role you think Job's wife plays in the cosmological questions and understanding of who God is.
I don't think I'll get to the point. I've written on that quite a bit. So Job's wife, the adversary and Job's wife really play minor literary roles. They're only the beginning. And after 2:7, you have neither of them. They are there to make certain points, to introduce the book, and you're not heard from again. So I will probably mention Job's wife briefly in the last lecture. But yeah. Yes.
Hi, I'm Jamelia Davis, first year MDiv. And I apologize because this question is going away from Job just a bit. You mentioned Earth being key.
What? Key, yes.
Earth is key and heaven is on. Now I have a very limited knowledge of mythology. But does the word Anunnaki come from on? No, not at all.
No.
Not like gods
No.
from heaven and earth or
Yeah.
anything like that.
Anunnaki is a divine council. Yeah. An and Ki is heaven and earth. It's a Sumerian term for universe. Heaven, earth, basically.
My name is Tosin, MDiv student, first year. My question is going to be based on the literary composition of the book of Job. Because Elihu was not among the friends that were kind of into conversations. And then by the time we look at the book of Job, we discover that in chapter 37 or chapter 36, it was more or less the final statement of Job. And I was thinking that was where God needs to kind of come in to approach Job's questions and position. But then again, we got into a long conversation of Elihu. And I was wondering, was that how it was in the Way manuscripts, talking about the arrangement of these chapters? Or was it, because I find that Elihu's conversation odd to Job, like why would Job say this is my final statement and Elihu came on board and Job didn't present any case against Elihu as he presented case against the three other friends. Then before the conclusion or before the God's view of the whole situation.
So Elihu's features are peculiar. So the consensus among scholars is that it's secondary, it's inserted, it doesn't belong, but none of the manuscripts shows that. Elihu is present in his very place in all the manuscripts. All the manuscripts. So Elihu, so scholars think that Elihu is the last conservative. And once Elihu has spoken, orthodoxy has lost its credibility. Elihu is like this young PhD who's come to the faculty and thinks all the old farts have nothing to say, and he's got new things to say. I think that's a caricature. I think Elihu's pictures belong exactly where it is. The wisdom dialogue has failed. Then comes young Elihu, like young Joseph, Elihu like young Daniel, to offer a revelatory word. I argue that Elihu's speeches represents mediated revelation, the best the human being can offer, but it's not a final word. So I think Elihu offers credible view. For Calvin, this was the voice of the Holy Spirit. Christians usually thought that Elihu represented the devil. But Calvin thought this was the voice of the Holy Spirit, and Jews thought Elihu's response was the most important. I think we've downplayed Elihu, and we should bring Elihu back. I think Elihu's place is exactly where it is, between Job's demand for answer and Yahweh's answer. If Yahweh had answered immediately after Job demanded, Job would not have handled it. So we needed Elihu to be there. It's in my articles in Theology Today, 1980 something.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Ken Rubin, first year MDiv student. So I've actually done this text for speech this year. And so my question is, with the discourse, what would the tone of the discourse be? Is God coming to Job with caring? Is God setting Job in his place? When we break it down like this, it looks like God's trying to unveil everything to Job. So is he, what do we think the tone is?
So we should wait to the end. Okay. So yeah, well, clearly there's a rebuke. There's a rebuke, but I think it'll be fleshed out as we go along. It's a rebuke, but it's not a complete rejection of Job, I'll argue. Yeah, this is only the introduction to a speech, right? Setting in context, then it's profoundly theological, as we'll see.
Well, listen. On that note, if he has 4 more lectures, we don't want to work with him. Please, everybody, tomorrow night, 7 p.m. back here. Dr. Seow. We also invite you all to join us for a reception right outside.